mammoth task ahead in terms of those mishaps and those things that are yet to happen. My own take is that there is a lot to learn from the 25 years of democracy. My take is that there is a lot to unlearn from what we have done, and my take is that there's a lot to relearn in order for us to find one another. So following that major session in the morning was followed by our own vivacious, larger-than-life Professor Chris Landsberg. You know, Professor Chris Landsberg has got this form of presence that when he opens, it's so complimentary. And the sessions were on governance, leadership, socio-economic transformation, and of course, we also had our own statistician general. So when I got home and I had guests, my children came. I don't like numbers, and I don't know them, and now I've made it thus far without numbers. So I really don't do numbers much, but you know what I'm saying? So I was trying to do numbers yesterday from Mr. Maluleke, and my children says, so now, where do you get this mortality rate and fertility? Are you sure? And I thought I was mixing what the statistician was saying. So that was great. And also we had our very new, where is that Dr. Poor? I saw him, very newly minted Dr. Poor. He also made such sterling presentations. Because these sessions were longer than anticipated, we dropped the very last session and had only time for session 3, the parallel breakout from the parallel breakaways. I did get feedback, because I was not here, that these sessions went very, very well. In the governance and leadership group, Kilebogile Lepile offered positive analysis of the achievements of the state, while her co-presenters Mkhokozisi Madlala and Dr. David Muhale referred to the multiple challenges confronting good governance and to emerging political pathologies. In the citizenship and identity session, the themes of marginalization emerged, themes of exclusion, themes of disadvantage, the feelings of being ignored. These were also issues that were discussed. Of course, these are always accompanied by apathy and all those kinds of negative things that happen. And so I'm not going to go through to every session that happened and try to say what people said. I think that that will come at the end today when the wrap-up is happening. Also, it will make people to buy the book that ideally is going to come from this session. So today, my role is to welcome everyone, and my role is also to welcome our esteemed panelists, and to also give over to you, Professor Susie Graham, to take this program forward. All the best, and thank you very much for having me once more.
Okay. Welcome everyone again. Thank you for that introduction. I'm very mindful of time, so I do want to just say a couple of words and then we're going to go straight into this morning's session. And I do warn the panelists, I did warn them that I'm ruthless with timekeeping this morning, given the prolonged session of yesterday. And so we'll be sticking to our times, so we have more discussion time, hopefully, before we break for tea. So I just wanted to say that while we review the quality of our democracy over the last 25 years, we must, of course, remember that we're not living in a vacuum, and that we do have neighbors who are important to us and should be, and that these relationships that we have regionally and continentally and globally are vital. And so it's important that we do analyze them, or consider them at least, going forward for the next 25 years. So it's with pleasure, really, that I introduce this panel, being the only IR panel at this conference. So no pressure, but we hope that you inform and inspire, because it's just up to you guys to do that. So we look forward to what you have to say. The panel is Citizenship, Identity, and International Relations. And I will just say a few words about our panel members, very briefly. They are, of course, all distinguished in all of their respective fields and have many, many, many degrees. So I will not go into that. But I do want to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Stephen Gordon from the Human Sciences Research Council, where he's a member of the Democracy and Governance and Service Delivery Program, and is also a member of the South African Social Attitude Survey Unit, and so he's going to tell us about xenophobia this morning. So I'll hand over to him, and he has 15 to 16 and a half-ish minutes to present.
Thank you very much. Am I on? Where do I? Should I just, I'm going to stand here. Excellent. Thank you very much. I normally at this point introduce myself, but that has been done so well for me that I will not do it. So we will move on to the title of my presentation today, which is Xenophobia in South Africa, Prejudicial, Attitudinal, and Behavioral Patterns in a Post-Apartheid Nation. What's very impressive about being able to speak to you right now and speak to the office of the presidency is that there was a time not too long ago which talking about xenophobia to policymakers was quite difficult, in which policymakers were concerned about the use of the word xenophobia to describe certain events in our country and certain patterns of behavior and attitudes in our country. And I welcome this return of a thinking government, of a government open to critical analysis, of a government willing to think in a more skeptical way about existing paradigms and to look at empirical evidence, despite the fact that that empirical evidence might not always say what you wanted to say. Now, to set the stage a little bit, let us say that South Africa is home to a substantial number of international migrants, although maybe not as many as some believe. Currently, just want to see if this, no, that doesn't work. Currently, South Africa, according to the United Nations, is home to about 4 million international migrants, the foreign-born. Right? And while this may sound like a large number, it is quite a small percentage of our overall national population. The number of international migrants in the country has grown objectively from where it was in 1990. A recent World Bank study has revealed that the decision to allow a higher level of international migrant inflow into the country was good from an economic standpoint. World Bank study showing a growth based on international migration in the wages and jobs of what is technically called the native born. Right? So very important to remember here, we are a country home to a substantial minority of international migrants. Unfortunately, this minority has been subject to violence, right? To various forms of violent hate crime. Now, often when we talk about this, we trace much of our discussion to the horrific events of May 2008, and much of our debate revolves around that single series of riots that took place, which led to the tragic death of 62 and more than 100,000 displaced. Now, while it's important to acknowledge the tragedy of that moment, we should not consider this the only anti-immigrant riot in the country, right? One of the first anti-immigrant riots to broke out in the Alexandria township, not far from where we are now, in which local residents marched on their police station demanding that Malawians, Mozambicans, and Zimbabweans go home. When the police refused to deport the local migrant population, there was, unfortunately, some violence that took place. And we have, in recent years, 2015, 2017, 2018, and of course, in the beginning of this year, seen smaller incidents of anti-immigrant violence, anti-immigrant hate crime. The non-proprietary platform, XenoWatch, has categorized hundreds of incidents of xenophobic hate crime, which have not made the national media, showing that this is a serious and significant problem. Now, while we acknowledge the seriousness of the issue, we must remember that this is not a problem unique to South Africa. This is not a South African problem. Many countries suffer from anti-immigrant hate crime, particularly in Western Europe, where we've seen the rise of right-wing, racist, xenophobic political movements and political parties. Now, studying attitudes towards international migrants and studying behavior towards that population group has been a little lackluster in the 1990s. right? And this is not just a problem of South Africa, but really a problem of the global South, in which research efforts have often been put into other areas, particularly when it comes to empirics, the hard numbers around attitudes and behavior. However, beginning in the late 1990s, South Africa saw the growth of active scholarship on this issue, particularly with the Southern African Migration Project, who did fantastic work looking at how South Africans think about international migrants and how they behave towards international migrants. Right? Since the tragic violence of May 2008, there's been a much greater and more robust survey and political science and social science interests in xenophobia. And unfortunately, despite this great level of progress, there are still certain gaps. And these are participation in violence, who is participating, how do ordinary people think about the causes of violence, and then what are public attitudes towards solutions to violence. Understanding these three things will allow us to better comprehend the existing problem and devise solutions to that problem that are both effective and enjoy broad public support. And I am going to attempt to outline public opinion data on both attitudes to international migrants as well as behavior towards international migrants here for you today. And this will really be the heart of my presentation. And I'm going to use the South African Social Attitude Survey to achieve this. It is one of the country's premier large public opinion surveys, started in 2003, with the goal of looking at social and political values in South Africa. And please, I love talking about SACES. If you have questions related to SACES, please let me know. Just to say that SACES is a nationally representative survey of all adults 16 years and older in the country. The sample size in any given year is about 3,000, right? It usually takes place at the end of the year. It is a door-to-door survey. We're not talking about those annoying telephone surveys that people are always asking you to complete. This is door-to-door, right? And follows the best ethical protocols. And we do attempt to visit most areas of the country. The blue dots are those areas visited by our fieldwork teams. We visit about 500 areas a year. And they have representation both in poor and rich areas, rural and urban, black, white, you name it, we try and go there. So let's talk about the results, which is why we are all here. So the first question that is particularly interesting for us is the following. Please indicate which applies to you. I generally welcome to South Africa all immigrants, some immigrants, or no immigrants. Right? And this question has been included in SACES every year since 2003. So now we have quite a long trend line on attitudes. And what we can see is that attitudes have remained fairly static over the period with some variation. So for example, you can see that negative attitudes were particularly high in 2007, right? About 6 months before the xenophobic violence of 2008. After the xenophobic violence and a media campaign against xenophobia, you saw an improvement in pro-immigrant attitudes, and then in subsequent years, a bit of a decline. And currently, right now, unfortunately, pro-immigrant attitudes are at one of their lowest ebbs in the last, say, 5-6 years. So this shows us that not all South Africans are anti-immigrant. In fact, only a minority hold the view that they would welcome no immigrants. Many take a more middle position, while a minority are welcoming to all. Building on this question, we wanted to know about participation in violent behavior towards international migrants. So we asked respondents if they had ever taken part in violent action to prevent immigrants from living or working in their neighborhood. And the response categories were as follows. I have done it in the past year. I have done it in the more distant past, I have not done it, but I might do it, I have not done it, and I would never do it. Now, before I show you the results of these questions, it is important to remember that respondents, very understandably, might be disinclined to disclose potentially incriminating information regarding their engagement in a behavior that we would, hopefully, recognize as quite socially undesirable. Right? So there may be significant underreporting. Right? However, when we look at the figures, right, here we see numbers in the hundreds of thousands, and then in the brackets we see national percentage. And what we can see here, having introduced this question in 2015 and continue it into 2018, is the remarkable stability of responses in which individuals do not change their views on this issue too much over time, suggesting the validity and durability of the measure. Secondly, that the share of the population who admits to engaging in anti-immigrant violence varies between 5 and about 8% over the period, right? Which suggests that social desirability around admitting participation in this behavior waxes and wanes over the period, but remains fairly consistent. We also, and this is, of course, I think you will admit, very, very worrying, we see that about 1/10 of the population indicates that, no, I have not engaged in anti-immigrant violence, but I would be prepared to do so. All right? So what is our main takeaway from this data? Firstly, that the vast majority of South Africans respond to this statement with, I have not done it and would never do it. Right? Vast majority of people rejecting xenophobic violence. But a substantial minority are in fact quite willing to engage in this behavior, and a smaller but still worrying minority indicate that they have in fact engaged in this behavior. Right? And so, again, let us remind ourselves of the limitations of this problem, right, regarding underreporting. But I want to move on and talk about something extremely interesting, which is, why do ordinary people think that violence against foreigners occurs? Right? We ask people, there are many opinions about why people take violent action against foreigners living in South Africa. Please tell me the main reasons why you think this happens. This, right, question was open-ended. I did not choose response categories for our participants. They gave their own responses. Right? And we put this in a little bit of a word map, and there are certain things that came out very strongly: jobs, drugs, and crime. Right? Why do people take violent action against foreigners? People said it was because of the drugs that foreigners bring, and it was because of the jobs that foreigners steal. And if we categorize this into categories, right, activities of foreign nationals came out as very, very strong amongst our population, right? 24% thought it was the criminal activities of foreign nationals that led to violence. 23% thought it was the economic activities of foreign nationals that led to this violence. And then about 12% said that foreigners did some other negative thing. Usually it was disease or the exploitation of women and children. Right? So this should worry us because it seems that quite a significant share of the population, about half, thought that foreign nationals were the cause of xenophobic violence, shifting the blame away from the perpetrator of the violence towards the victim blaming. Although we did heartily see some people blame psychological factors, right, including beliefs about foreigners which were common in the community, people's emotions, right, people's anger, people's envy, right, people's ignorance came through. Other factors received far less attention, right? The economic environment, for example, poverty, unemployment in a very abject sense, was only mentioned by about 6% of our sample, right? While general law and order problems, again, was only mentioned by a small minority. What we find when we look at responses by attitudes towards foreigners is that those who were more likely to disparage foreigners, who did not welcome foreigners, were more likely to blame the violence on foreigners themselves, right? To shift the blame from the perpetrators of those violence to the victims of those violence. Those who were more welcoming, those more pro-immigrant, they tended to view the issue from a much more psychological perspective, blaming the ignorance, wrong information, and the emotions of perpetrators. Right? So we can see here a bit of a divide in how South Africans think about this very, very important problem. But another interesting divide that we came across was how people think about the solutions to this problem. So we asked people, there are many different opinions about how to stop people taking violent action against foreigners living in South Africa. What do you think can be done to stop violent action against foreigners living in the country? And we got a lot of different responses, right? So this is a bit of a word cloud on those different responses, and you can see that no one response kind of came forward and dominated proceedings, right? So if we categorize these, several factors came through very, very strongly. So they were immigration factors, right? About 22% of the population thought that the solution to xenophobic violence was to expel all foreign nationals, right? So quite a prejudicial approach to the problem. 11% thought better border management would resolve the issue. About 8% thought that foreigners should change their behavior, and this would solve matters. So you can see here, right, that immigration factors came through quite strongly, right? We also found that a substantial minority of the population believed that it was social factors which would win the day. Education and awareness campaigns, community dialogue, and attitudinal change were listed by a not too insubstantial minority of the population, right? Better resource management was also mentioned, although perhaps not as frequently as some would have thought, by about 10%, and about 13% focused on better law enforcement. And in this graph, what we did is we overlaid responses to our previous question on what caused xenophobic violence with solutions to xenophobic violence. Those who blame the activities of foreigners for xenophobic violence were much more liable to support immigration factor solutions, particularly mass expulsion, right? Those who blame psychological factors were much more likely to put forward, thank you very much, to put forward education, community dialogue, and attitudinal change. How people think about the causes of violence leads very strongly to their thinking about how violence should be solved. Yeah? And now I come to the end of my presentation, which is very good because I only have a minute left. Right, so by understanding how the public views anti-immigrant violence, we can better comprehend which prevention mechanisms would be most acceptable to the general population. Right? One of the problems that we have encountered in our research is that many people in our country blame the victims of xenophobic violence, right? And this victim blaming, in many studies, has shown to impede prosecution of hate crime by law enforcement, right? And in fact, to create a culture, a climate in which this kind of crime is not really seen as crime, right? This emboldens attackers and makes this type of crime more likely to break out, right? What we need to do in South Africa is change the way people think about the causes of xenophobic violence, right? To educate them that their views on the causes of violence are not the most conducive to finding a progressive solution to this issue. This means contending with the issue of hearts and minds. How do we change people's views on this important matter so that they will be more supportive and more willing to engage in the kind of solutions which have been shown to be effective? And those solutions, as other countries, Canada, Germany, for example, who have pursued very successful immigration integration programs, have shown, is those related to social factors. Education and awareness, changing attitudes, right? Informing people, community dialogue. All right, so I know, I'm going to slip the last slide. I know I have presented quite a data-driven presentation, and a presentation that contains many worrying messages, right? But I hope that, particularly in our discussion, we can end on a moment of hope and a path forward to reducing the serious problem of anti-immigrant hate crime in our country. I want to thank you on behalf of myself, as well as the broader team at the Human Science Research Council. Thank you again.
Dr. Gordon, I don't think you have to worry about it. I think we like data as well. Social scientists are not immune to liking data. We do like it. It's important. Okay, I'm mindful. I want to just bring a little bit of humor, some light relief to that conversation, because it's heady stuff, it's hard stuff to listen to and to hear. So just something I want to paraphrase that talk show host and political commentator in the US, Dennis Miller, once said. He said, "Xenophobia doesn't benefit anybody, unless, of course, you're playing high-stakes Scrabble, in which case it does." So I think that sums that up. So I would like now to introduce our next speaker, who's very important here in terms of the conference, being one of the main directors of MISTRA. So I'd like to ask Holelwa Kasha-Katia to please come forward. She's the current Director of Project Management at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflections, and she's going to talk to us about scenario planning. So we're going to listen to her and talk about social cohesion in 2030. So let's all welcome her, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to those who are returning from yesterday and those who are joining us for the first time. Now, my presentation is more inward-looking than the previous one, but I suppose, there will be some overlaps in terms of some of the themes that are experienced there. I will be presenting to you the Indlulamiti South Africa Scenarios 2030 initiative, whose goal was to engage with the idea of the lack of cohesion in South Africa. So this was an initiative that was started by many stakeholders. There's a number of partners, with the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection being one of them, leading the research components thereof. But there are other stakeholders drawn from the private sector, from civil society, and so on. I know some of you here have heard about the scenarios or have read about them or have encountered them elsewhere. However, what I will try to do today is not to bore you so much with the background to the scenarios and how we got to the storylines. So it will be very high level, but I'll pay more attention towards the work that we've been doing lately in terms of monitoring our progress as a country. So it's also more forward-looking, thus addressing the second part of the title of this conference, which is what happens next. So the process started with us looking at the key question, which is normal in any scenarios building process. So what we're trying to answer was the key question that is, what would a socially cohesive South Africa look like, and to what degree is it attainable by 2030? And now we use 2030 as our horizon because we wanted to align it to the National Development Plan, which is our blueprint as the country, but also there's also the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which also have the same horizon. So we felt that is more meaningful, even though 2030 is only about 11 years, from now. However, as a country, we all know that we don't do much long-term planning, or we constantly developing plans and policies without getting to a point where we implement. So this is an attempt at that long-term view to our challenges as a country. Now,
From the key questions, we did our research, we interviewed various stakeholders, and we identified variables that impact on social cohesion in our country. But what we came up with were the three driving forces, or otherwise the KDFs, which drive social cohesion in this country. In terms of this panel, because what I'm also looking at is the idea of citizenship and identity, I'll pay specific attention to our third key driving force, which is resistance, resentment, and reconciliation. However, these three driving forces, they all work together and they appear in all our storylines. The resistance, resentment, and reconciliation, it is mostly about how we have a different understanding of our history. I think that is the point of departure, because we have such a fractured history as a country. But that separation has not changed, but also even in terms of how we look at our history and how we have, or the road we've traveled thus far, we have a different understanding. We contest the space of the history itself, we contest the space of who the liberators were, we contest whether we have attained freedom or not. We also contest the space of the transition itself, with young people saying there was no democratic transition. However, those who actually participated in the writing of the Constitution and participated in the Codesa moment feel that it's unfair to say there was no transition whatsoever, but rather to say it's an incomplete transition. A lot of this came up around the Fees Must Fall, Roads Must Fall movement, wherein we saw younger people really demonstrating a lot of resentment regarding the transition and their current realities. We saw campuses across the country with a lot of contestation, raising the history, questioning liberation, whether there was liberation at all. So that's why we named that KDF resistance, resentment, and reconciliation, because the idea of reconciliation is still contested, and there is resentment, in particular resentment by younger people against the older generations, where now we're starting to hear young people saying even people like Mandela have sold out. And, but as I was saying, this KDF also works with the other two KDFs, which entail inequality, which we still experience as a country. Yesterday, all the presentations actually alluded to how we are the most unequal country in the world. And that inequality there, it's not just about material inequality, it's about inequality in terms of access, inequality in terms of resources, and so on. And it also works with institutional capacity, because we are so unequal, you find that in terms of how our institutions are resourced also, there is a lack of capacity, there's a lot of leadership. But what I want to emphasize is that this is not just limited to the state, because when you talk about capacity, we tend to point our fingers towards the state, whereas in academia, there is institutional and leadership issues. We've seen in the private sector all the ethical questions that are being raised there, and so on. So from these key driving forces, we then wrote our storylines. I won't delve into those, but those who are familiar with the scenarios would have heard about a bourgeois scenario, which entails an enclave, a bourgeois nation. So this is a nation that's even more separated than we are right now. So this is the potential future for our country. So the three storylines are the three different eventualities or pathways that we could undertake as a country. But this one, it's about greater divisions. There's a lot of unstable process of land reform. You find that the elite are also benefiting more from all these resources, especially when it comes to the land reform process. And we also see privatization of everything, and we're starting to see signs of that with the establishment of all these security estates and so on, wherein the rich have privatized everything, education, security, their schools, they even have a hospital there, but the poor remain outside those walls. But they also do their own privatization from below, wherein you start seeing all these early childhood development centers in the townships. You're seeing people trying to find a way to make a living because the state is so eroded that it is unable to deliver on any of the basic services. The second story, or scenario rather, is Nile Walk scenario, which is a nation that's in step with itself. Here we see the Constitution being upheld and affirmed. We see a focus on early childhood development. So this is a nation that is coming together, falling in, upholding the Constitution. There's a moment where even the NDP is updated, and we see society rallying around this NDP. We see faster land reform, which also has a focus on urban properties. And we're starting to see signs of that, wherein some of the major political parties now talking about urban land redistribution. The third scenario is the Gwara scenario. This is now a false dawn. We've been talking about the new dawn, but in this future, that new dawn is not, it's actually quite a false dawn. Here we see major or key institutions being partially liberated, but even more so, some quickly get recaptured. We know right now we have the state capture inquiry. In this scenario, nothing happens after the state capture inquiry, but instead, some of the major institutions get recaptured by the emerging elites. But also we see opposition parties being able to form a coalition to a point where we foresee that by 2024, they could even eventually eject the ANC. And because we have this coalition government, we know how unstable those are. There's a lot of contestation around the number of provinces. We also see a coalition government that is even more forceful, and we see freedoms being curtailed in society, so you don't have these freedoms where you can protest and so on. But now, since we launched the scenarios in June 2018 last year, we then undertook a process of national roadshows wherein we sought to seek strategic relationships with partners to also promote the scenarios so that we can get institutions to be mindful of these eventualities when they do their planning. In particular, institutions in government, the private sector, and civil society. But what is most important is that we were also asked by our stakeholders to actually establish a monitoring and evaluation framework through a barometer, because there was this sense that many scenarios exercises have been undertaken by the country starting from our transition, but nothing happened in terms of monitoring those scenarios to see where society is shifting over time. So we undertook that and we launched that this year. It was last month on the 21st of June, which we've since deemed Indlulamiti Day. And we also aim to kickstart a national dialogue, and us participating on platforms like this one is to actually do that so that we can encourage dialogue. But most importantly, our first prize would be to inspire social compacting. You heard the president referring to social compacting yesterday, and so did my boss, Mr. Joel Neshidenze. So this is something that we're looking at as the initiative. Now, why a barometer? Now, we want to do this barometer to actually monitor the shift in perceptions, to also monitor the trends. So what we've done is to draw from existing data sets. We've looked at data sets that exist at States SA, Afrobarometer, and so on. So there's a number of data sets that we've looked at, I think more than 10 that we've combined so that we can monitor the trends or the direction that the country is going. So, where are we today since that launch on that Indlulamiti Day in 2018? This is now focusing on the hard trends. So what we did was to isolate the key driving forces that are referred to at the beginning, which was the institutional capacity and leadership, social inequality, and the resistance, resentment, and reconciliation. And we developed indicators that we could use to monitor progress over the years. We identified 22 indicators under leadership, and those had to do with state capacity, policy-making processes, political representation, in the different tiers of government, civil society, and also what is happening in the business environment, because we have to emphasize that we must not lose sight of what's happening in the private sector. And in terms of social inequality, there were 19 indicators that we identified, and those had to do with the macroeconomic policies of the country, because others felt that maybe there could be a need to actually, reconsider our macroeconomic policies, issues of unemployment, poverty, education, and so on. But most importantly, in terms of issues of identity, we were monitoring a sense of, we found data sets that monitor or do surveys around, how people feel about the country, the sense of hope, but also this notion of this shared history, because we don't have a shared history. You can see on public platforms, there's always these constant debates around where we're coming from, but also in terms of how South Africans feel about the constitution and democratic values, and also the notion of trust across races, in institutions. Trust, South Africans do not trust the state at all, but also there's this lack of trust between the state and the private sector across races, even down to the so-called tribal groupings. But also we are also going to be monitoring this notion of identity, because we found that we do not have a sense of a common identity or shared values as a country. So that's another thing that we are monitoring. So in terms of the results for the first year, so remember now we're going to be monitoring up until 2030. Around resistance, resentment, and reconciliation, looking at the scenarios, that's where we are as a country. So around that, we are more in a bourgeois nation, which is this separation. So we are still so separated around these issues of identity, reconciliation. So we're seeing the nation moving further apart as opposed to coming together. In terms of institutional capacity and leadership, we are also in a bourgeois. Again, it's a separation. You have the elite and also the poor. You go down to social inequality, which is quite scary. Social inequality, we are in Gwara, which was the last scenario, that one of lawlessness and institutions being recaptured. So you can see that key driving force there is landing us squarely on Gwara Nation. In terms of the data sets that we looked at, we're at 79% in Gwara. So now, what do these mean? So we've done an aggregate now of the results of the key driving forces. And now, as you can see, the aggregate as a nation, 1 year down since June 2018, we are somewhat between isibourgeois and Gwara, with a stronger pull towards the Gwara Nation, which is not the ideal scenario we would like to be at the moment. But that is where we are. We are hoping that these results will shift by the time we reach Indulamiti Day on the 21st of June 2020. But that's where we are. We are continuously monitoring this. We're doing surveys now so that we can also add a bit of the qualitative components to it. Because right now, what we're looking at are the different data sets. So how do we get from this Gwara bourgeois towards a more socially cohesive South Africa? We've also thought maybe we should look at economic modeling, because we've talked about how we have all these excellent policies in South Africa. However, nothing is being done about them. So what we did was we commissioned ADRS, which then did economic modeling. And what it does is to look at existing policies to try and identify the policy choices or combinations that would land us on any of those three scenarios. And in terms of bourgeois, the policy choices that we'd be making are those, it's actually what is happening right now, where the status quo is retained with a focus on growth, but really not paying attention to the poor. And also that focus on growth tends to benefit the rich. Now, the policy choices that we would make to get to Nile Walk are more poor policy combinations, and those would entail paying attention to the unskilled or the unemployed, because we do know that our country has a lot of unskilled people, and with the future looking like it's biased towards skilled job opportunities, then that's something, it's a policy change. I mean, we talked about, there was a lot of talk about what can we forego? what are the trade-offs? So that's something that we could look at if we want to land ourselves in Naila walk or more towards pro-poor policy combinations or choices. To get to Gwara, these are the policy choices that we would make. And remember, I mentioned that there would be this coalition government if we're in Gwara. So there's a lot of instability there. But also there will be a push towards cutting subsidies, towards cutting public works. There's also that reduction. Remember, there's a reduction in provinces. So there's this focus on reduction, and that also does not take us anywhere. Now, another option that we're coming up with is to try and inspire social compacting. Why social compacting? Because we've realized that countries that have introduced the idea of social compacting are those that prefer social dialogue as a mechanism to move society. And we have experience in that. South Africa has done that. The transition moment of South Africa was a social compacting moment, and there's a lot of dialogue. We are leaders in dialogue. But we, as MISTRA as well, we've undertaken research towards, what social compacting is. And we've looked at countries such as Singapore, we've looked at Netherlands, Sweden, Ireland, South Korea. But you'd find that there the compacting was around labor issues, wages, working hours, and so on. So right now we are updating that research so that we can look at countries that are more similar to us with, a history that's similar to ours. So we're trying to look at more south to south comparisons and maybe a country in Africa. But also South Africa itself is commendable for finding ways to collectively find solutions towards our challenges, as much as we think we are so far apart, but we have a history of doing so. So this is something we should be able to do. But at the moment, as part of our monitoring, we are going to be looking at some forms of social compacting that have been taking place, such as the Jobs Summit. We've seen the Investment Summit. So we're also going to be looking closely at those to see if there's any social compacting, and if there is any, what is happening there? Are any jobs being created? Are there any investments? To what extent? And so that will bring me to the end of this presentation. But I'd like to thank you all for your patience, and also just to acknowledge those who helped us with this research. It's Social Surveys Africa, but also ADRS, who did the economic modeling. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Lelwa. I think we should always appreciate the value of scenario planning, if only to show us how much worse it could get so that we do better faster. So thank you for that. Okay, next up is Professor Garth Lapierre, who we all know, I'm sure, but who is an extraordinary professor in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria and also an independent consultant. And he is going to talk to us today about the geoeconomics of global trade. So we welcome Professor Lapierre. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning to everybody. Let me start with an anecdote. Way back when I was a graduate student doing my PhD at Yale, Ali Mazrui came to deliver a lecture titled, "What Ails Africa?" And, he lamented the fact that Africa tends to be the graveyard of grand schemes. And he provided a really riveting critique of the anatomy of failure of the Lagos Plan of Action. And today we have Agenda 2063, and a very integral component of Agenda 2063, which is a 50-year vision of continental integration, a very important and integral component of Agenda 2063 is the CFTA, the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is what I'm going to speak about, and tease out what I think are the geo-economic implications and the environment in which the CFTA will unfold. Now, the CFTA is a very bold initiative. It's bold in its ambition, in its promise, as well as its scope, because it binds the continent of 1.2 billion people, a GDP of 2.2 trillion, in a common enterprise of integration. Very importantly, once this agreement gets out of first gear, as it were, it will help to increase the level of intra-African trade from the current 17% to 52% in 5 years, provided the member states get the basics right. They must get the basics right. So there are 54 out of 55 countries that have now signed on to the operational phase of the CFTA, which was launched on the 4th and the 5th of this month. There are 22 countries that have ratified its instruments, and this country, South Africa, is one of the first to sign the instruments of ratification. So the operational phase of the free trade agreement will come into effect on the 1st of July of next year, 2020. However, the adoption of this agreement occurs at a very turbulent moment in the global trading system, as well as in international economic relations. And we are witnessing the manifestations of these: rising military tensions, very disruptive trade and commercial relations, increasing environmental degradation, the abuse of cyber sources of hard and soft power, difficult proxy conflicts, and very corrosive nativist identities. So this really points to what I would call an underlying existential dilemma of serious structural, political, and normative deficits in current forms of global governance and multilateral institutions. So there is disruption from without and degradation from within. The manifestations of the disruption from without is what I call the VUCA effect. You can write this down. V-U-C-A. There is greater volatility, that's the V. There's greater uncertainty, the U. There's greater complexity and there's greater ambiguity. And the VUCA effect really unsettles whatever relative stability there is in the international system, compounded by the degradation from within. Rules, norms, and standards of multilateral cooperation are being eroded. And the manifestations of those are economic nationalism, deglobalization, increasing protectionism, and an atavistic turn, I would say, to distinguishing people and regions between us and them. So it's geoeconomics that I want to argue that has come to define the post-Cold War arena of rivalry and conflict as much as military confrontation. And geoeconomics in this sense then represents the new grammar of commerce and the logic of conflict. And an essential underpinning of geoeconomics then points to how economic ties that bind countries together are commanded and manipulated for certain purposes. And that is to maintain levels of power and hegemony over flows of goods, capital, services, and data. Nevertheless, it is the neo-mercantilist and divisive tendencies in the geoeconomic realm, I think, that provide African countries with a really fresh opportunity to regain their unity and solidarity in global trade. And they can achieve this by establishing regional and continental by promoting regional and continental dynamics that advance global value chains, establish global value chains, different forms of productive activity, and that take advantage quite fundamentally of emerging strategic opportunities in the global south, especially in relations with the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and bold developments such as China's Belt and Road Initiative. So there are very strong complementarities. And if you look at UNCTAD studies, they reveal that there are now south-based supply chains linked to regional production hubs in manufactured products and processed commodities that could really serve as export platforms for both developed and developing countries. So successful integration into the global economy in view of these geo-economic dynamics that I have sketched really depends on sustained productivity growth and building viable industrial services and manufacturing bases as critical components of a global South trade strategy. For example, there are great opportunities, it seems to me, in developing an Afro-Indian ocean community as a multipolar and a multi-layered complex. And here, the Continental Free Trade Area and the 16 countries of the Asian Pacific Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership could be the pivot in providing a robust and promising access of trade and development cooperation. However, the challenge for Africa, among many others, is that its traditional trading partners, particularly the United States and the European Union, these still exercise what I would call neo-colonial forms of influence and control over the pace of African countries' growth and development through their institutionalized trade and cooperation frameworks. In the case of the European Union, it's the Economic Partnership Agreements. In the case of the United States, it's the African Growth and Opportunity Act. And these, in many ways, are really antithetical. They are antithetical to the letter and spirit of the CFTA's underlying philosophy of self-determination, Pan-Africanism, and self-reliance. Quite crucially, it must be said that Africa can no longer be called a hopeless continent, as The Economist once had it. Its collective economy is now on track to be worth $3 trillion by 2030, and 19 African countries are expected to grow by at least 5% in this period. There's also been significant progress with democratization, political liberalization, good governance, and popular electoral participation. Yet economic conditions are likely to remain difficult, particularly with regard to domestic resource mobilization, welfare redistribution, capital flows, terms of trade, and the political climate. So the long-term success of the CFTA will really depend on putting in place the necessary policy measures such as building state and human capacity for effective participation in the CFTA processes. There's also the difficult coalface, the technical coalface, which has to be negotiated to get the agreement into some kind of serious and sustained momentum. And a brief sampling would include here the trade in goods, the rules of origin, non-tariff barriers, intellectual property, dispute settlement, trade in services, et cetera, et cetera. So I conclude now with two observations. And I'll give my 5 minutes to Dr. Naga so that she can have 20. So two observations. The first is that there are emerging signs and symptoms that the post-war liberal international order and the established hegemony of the Euro-Atlantic world might be coming to an end. And this has much to do with the gradual and incremental changes in the redistribution of global wealth and power, which are providing the impetus towards a different kind of order, which is grounded in the Indo-Pacific complex, with India and China providing much of the gravitational pull in that complex, but which nevertheless will have geoeconomics as the distinct zeitgeist for defining the logic of conflict and the grammar of commerce. Under Donald Trump and Brexit, we are already witnessing a very malevolent turn towards neo-mercantilist practices, economic nationalism, and trade protectionism as the modalities of choice in interstate competition and rivalry. And then secondly, where does this leave the continent? Where does this leave Africa? Well, you know, the 2019 March issue of The Economist proclaimed that there is a new scramble for Africa and then offers advice on how Africa can win it. And this really reflects, I think, Africa's increasing geostrategic relevance, its connectivity to political geography, and its emergence as a central maritime area for the blue economy, the global blue economy. So in short, Africa is now a strategic anchor in international relations after centuries of marginalization and exploitation. The Economist then goes on to ask, how can Africa and its citizens be turned into winners by insisting on a form of globalization that works for Africa and the world alike? So on reflection, could the CFTA, could the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which becomes a free trade area on the 1st of July next year, could it provide the template for a new methodology of developmental regionalism, and could it provide a comprehensive vision for trade and development that can still make globalization work? I think it can. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Lapierre, for drawing attention to the vast opportunities that the African continent has to offer in the geopolitical and geoeconomic space, and also for reminding us that we are not the hopeless continent that the rest of the world brands us to be so very often. So thank you for that and for sharing your thoughts with us and your wisdom. Okay, next up, our final panelist for today is Dr. Dawn Nacher, who is working right now in the Deanery of the Faculty of Humanities here at UJ. Her research work includes the political economy and security issues of African politics, and right now, excitingly, she's focusing on the Fourth Industrial Revolution and Africa's place in the world in her research. But today, she's going to regale us with tales of South Africa's 25 years of region building and regional integration in Africa. So let's welcome Dr. Nacher.
Thanks, Vicky. And may I just take this opportunity to thank my colleagues from MISTRA for this partnership and my vice deans from the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Camilla Naidu here and Professor Dumisani Moyo. So I'll just load my presentation quickly. Opening up this document, and we can start. So, good morning, honorable participants, distinguished guests. This presentation is focused on South Africa's 25 years of region building and integration, and it's anchored in South Africa's domestic reality. Now, the major arguments made in this presentation are focused on region building and integration, but it's concentrated on agro-industrialization prospects and the blue economy within a regional approach. Now, the core discussion made in this presentation weighs heavily on economic growth models that purport how partnerships formed among African states by South Africa have the potential to achieve economic growth, particularly with peripheral economies through industrialization efforts. Now, the second part of the presentation touches on South Africa's peace-building role in Africa, as well as providing recommendations for consideration by South Africa's government. Now, from the onset, it is important to note that all actions taken by a country in region building and integration through trade, as well as through simultaneous external trade relations being conducted, will affect the country's socioeconomic growth, either negatively or positively. Now, that's also discussed as South Africa's trade relations with key external actors, mainly Europe and the US, and the impact of such relations on regional trade and on South Africa's domestic situation. Now, economists such as Harun Borat and Fintarp, they have highlighted Africa's structural dilemma, but they show that there have been a major labor shift away from agriculture towards the services sector. But in the case of South Africa, the country has low human capital levels. The majority of its workers in the services sector are employed mainly in informal, low-wage and low-productivity jobs. Now, also the manufacturing sector in South Africa, that is shrinking, with a considerable decline being seen in value-added commodities, and inequalities between rich and poor, that is widening throughout the continent, in fact, the African continent that has, at the moment, 193 million people, the working poor, earning less than $2 a day. Now, on the other hand, Africa's food and beverage markets are expected to reach $1 trillion by 2030, and that's up from $313 billion in 2010. Now, such a projection presents enormous opportunities for South Africa's government to enhancing the agro-industrialization sectors. And there's a structural shift ought to be made, therefore, from agriculture toward agro-industrialization of high-value added manufacturing sectors such as textiles, garment manufacturing, leather and leather products, food processing and canning, and among others, and creating agro-industrialization parks and special economic zones such as the Maputo Development Corridor that was created between South Africa and Mozambique, and through further partnerships being formed among African states with a view to creating economic growth and not poverty. Now, despite previous challenges over the years, South Africa has shown tremendous progress in guarding over its region building and integration efforts, and replaced the Europe-South Africa Trade Development Cooperation Agreement of 1999 and renegotiated under the Southern African Development Community Economic Partnership Agreement, the SADC-EPA, with Southern African countries in the main, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, Eswatini, and Mozambique, and to redress key trade areas which had previously negatively impacted BLNE markets in the past, and that was specifically during the 2000s. Now, South Africa's textile market was also not spared by its own experiences of similar negative trade patterns with the African Growth Opportunity Act trade agreement, with a drop in textiles in 2000 from $562 million to only $95.6 million in 2007. Now, this new SADC-EPA agreement, though, includes shielding sensitive sectors from the European competitors in the domestic market, and this the South African negotiators have enforced, or there would have been no EPA agreement, which was eventually signed in 2016. Now, a list of 251 EU geographical indications and 105 South Africa geographical indications have been agreed to. Now, South Africa is also a huge export and import sector with powerful economies with the US. South Africa's total exports in 2018 were 88.6 billion rand, and total imports from the US to South Africa during that same period were 73 billion rand. Now, South Africa's exports to Europe were 262 billion rand, with vehicles contributing about 26% of total exports to the EU in 2017. Now, exports from Europe to South Africa in that same year were 338 billion. But the question is, who is benefiting? Now, South Africa's total import trade with Africa amounted to only 109 billion rand, and total exports 311 billion. Most African governments are overly keen to conduct international trade while belonging to the tripartite free trade area, and now also the continental free trade area, adhering to 100% tariff lines. And these two agreements are also running on parallel tracks, while negotiating tariffs and rules of origin having been the major priorities. The South African government must consider how to develop value-added industrialization products of 2 or 3 key outputs with continental states during these negotiations. Total intercontinental trade, as we've heard, is only 17%. Now, trading more with Europe means region building and integration efforts cannot work to the benefit of achieving socioeconomic growth. Also, the incorrect business policies in South Africa will result in continuous inequality and not growth for the majority of South Africa's people. And region building and integration efforts that are focused on trade, that is generally conducted and primarily concerned with effecting positive socioeconomic impact back home. Powerful economies in a regional bloc can also lead to the convergence of a trade bloc, the coming together of. And it is for this important economic reason, and among several others, that Europe distanced South Africa from the African, Caribbean, and Pacific bloc during the Loam Conventions in 1990 and the 2000 Cotonou Agreement, which is now post-2000 agreement, which is being renegotiated. And in so doing, Europe ensured the divergence of the Africa, Caribbean, Pacific bloc from Africa while gaining easy entry into Africa's markets and putting in place several economic partnership agreements. Therefore, there ought to be an understanding among Africa's states that if global value chains are what South Africa and the continent at large are wanting to achieve, then governments must come to terms with a realist perspective that major markets and powerful states are likely to show less compassion towards supporting Africa's achievements of value additions, and also they are less concerned with it gaining a competitive global edge. Now, economists are advocating for the development of value chains through the gateway model. But when looking at Africa's lion economies, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, and Egypt, not much cooperation among states are being made in key agricultural produce. And similarly, among Southern African states, there are very little partnerships among African countries being formed. And also, just to mention a few examples, the value chain for soya, for example, in South Africa, Zambia, and Zimbabwe are non-existent. Though Zambia has a soya trade surplus, South Africa is importing soya from international markets. And also, South Africa, Egypt imports palm oil from Malaysia, not from Nigeria. Sudan imports wheat from Australia, yet Africa has huge wheat and maize producers. Now, South Africa imports cocoa beans also from the United States, yet Africa has the largest cocoa market in the world. With Nigeria, on the other hand, for example, has spent $2 billion annually on international rice imports. And that country is consuming 50% of what it consumes annually. Sugar is the cheapest commodity to produce in the Southern African region for 9 countries. South Africa's major trade export partners regionally are Botswana, Mozambique, and Namibia and South Africa in the region, and import sugar from Swaziland. That is pegged to the Southern African Customs Union, a member state. On Zambia's part, its largest export destination is the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, and Mauritius. However, in the case of Mauritius, DRC sugar is further exported to Europe, and Tanzania, on the other hand, does not import sugar from the region at all, and the country's sugar demands are met by India and the United Arab Emirates. Now, sugarcane is also a critical convergence point for bioenergy. During the crop season, Mauritius sugar mills export power to its national grids, and Ethiopia is also attempting to transform its sugarcane industry to surplus power, and its 2016 production of sugar and ethanol totaled 300,000 tons. Now, instead of creating value additions among these few examples that are provided and build agro-industrialization that can enhance more employment and greater socioeconomic growth, South Africa exports 150,000 tons of raw sugar to Europe because it is duty-free. Now, while import finished goods such as chocolate, we import about $120 million. Now, although South Africa has a strong regional monopoly, its small and medium businesses are also battling to gaining entry into the markets of larger industries, and there is considerable deindustrialization. For example, Tiger Brands is taking the lion's share in the region, followed by Lovo and Tongaat Hewlett. And this is similarly the case in the leather industry. A handful of white conglomerates benefit from South Africa's leather industry, and that also results in considerable deindustrialization with no entry for black businesses. At the global level, the most lucrative global leather industry is the EU's market. EU leather goods sector comprises about 36,000 enterprises and generates a turnover of about 48 billion euros, and they employ around 435,000 people. And South Africa supports the trade with Europe and supports its market for leather. and rawhides in 2016, it was 2 billion rand, and 1.4 billion rand with Asia, compared to a meager 790 million rand with the rest of Africa. Now, while Kenya has great potential in the leather products, its total livestock population in 2016 was 127.5 million, with major research, design, and technology programs that they have implemented. Now, strong partnerships can provide a vibrant agro-industry for building cooperation, and the African continent on its part is also currently the largest producer of rawhides and skins as semi-processed leather, but they contributed only $4 billion in 2015 out of the total global leather industry that was worth $120 billion annually. Now, with regard to the blue economy, the African Union has developed its 2050 Africa's Integrated Maritime Strategy for governments to support, in support of maritime challenges and opportunities. And Africa has the potential to unlock $1 trillion per year in total maritime commerce. But South Africa on its part is also hoping to grow its blue economy sector from 54 billion rands and a measly 316,000 jobs in 2010 to 177 billion rands, targeting 1 million jobs by 2033. Now, another South African manufacturing company, De Beers, through Deb Marine, they already are involved in Windhoek's diamonds in the deep sea and putting together plans to build the world's largest custom-built diamond mining vessel, measuring 577 feet long. And what is unique about this is that no human hands have touched the diamonds during the entire production at sea. Now, South Africa's good intentions towards the region are resoundingly clear, as we've heard in Professor Lapierre's presentation, evidently in the signing of the African Continental Free Trade Area in March 2018, and that came into force in July 2019. And similarly, South Africa's major role played in the Southern African Customs Union, SACU contributing 98% of the revenue generated through trade in that pool. South Africa is thus negotiating regional and continental trade deals, making entry quite easy for businesses into these markets. Therefore, the government has to go a step further and guard over smaller industries and implement business policy for all businesses that benefit the country socioeconomically and that incorporate into policy academic outputs of doctorates in research and training for youth that has direct socioeconomic impact in the long run. Now, moving to peacekeeping, South Africa has also sought to provide a peacekeeping environment regionally and allowing for a stable market that is attractive to foreign investors. And it remains a custodian of peacekeeping in Africa and as a cornerstone of its foreign policy engagements through the South African National Defence Force. And South Africa is the 17th largest contributor of peacekeepers, and these engagements constitute 1,191 military and police personnel deployed in the UN and joint AU-UN peacekeeping missions, including MONUSCO in the DRC, UNAMID in Darfur, and UNMISS in South Sudan. Now, 7 South African Infantry Battalion of 850 members are currently deployed, as well as an aviation detachment deployed in the DRC. And it's important that for region building, South Africa should not shy away from protecting regional interests, given that such relations are towards continental security, like France and the US and India has maintained peacekeepers in the African continent, guarding their parochial interests with very little gains to the continent, given the protection warranted by powerful states to minimize conflicts. The Continental Free Trade Area, that is also relevant. Now, I just provide 2 recommendations. First is that South African government must implement government policy that binds agro-industries to regional markets that is focused on accessing beneficiation of regional downstream products with a view to create further employment potential. While governments and prominent business industry implement policy and loyalty, they should create the conditions also for smaller enterprises and such which afford knowledge sharing and also one that allow for inputs from black businesses and smaller companies into the outputs of larger companies to benefit the regional value addition and agro-industrialization chain. My second recommendation is that the South African government must enhance South Africa's economic transformation program to engage and create the space for existing and new black businesses. This policy must apply the Department of Trade and Industry's supply-demand model, but it must expand its objection with a view to be indicative of incentivizing big industries, intending to build national and regional small black businesses within their own market through law and policy implementation. Thank you. Sorry. Just lock this.
Thanks, Dr. Nacher. Thank you so much, Dr. Nacher, for that very informative discussion. I have to say, speaking on behalf of, I'm sure, all the women in this room, any trade agreement that could make chocolate less expensive, we could get behind. Am I right? I'm right. I know it. So thank you for that. I'm actually listening to your talk. Something came to mind, an African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. And I think that just applies to all talks on the panel today, I think. So I think with that, let's open up for discussion. We have literally 12 or so minutes for Q&A, so let's see how many we can pump out. So with that in mind, can I please ask, if you do ask a question, please keep it concise, introduce yourself at the beginning, and although we obviously value everyone's contribution today, we do not have time for life stories or dissertations, so get to the point quickly, please. Okay, so hands, and I'll take the first round. I saw ladies first, okay? I saw your hand first, and we'll go back around the room that way. Okay, so please go ahead and ask your question. Here at the front in the pink. Yes.
Okay, good. Good morning, it's Sipogazi from MISTRA. My question is for Dr. Stephen. On your presentation about South Africa's, that table where you show your stats on how South Africa, I forgot the title of that slide, but basically I wanted to find out if those responses where South Africans were showing resistance towards foreigners getting employment, if the responses were not influenced by the election cycle, because I couldn't help but notice that during the election years, the spike went up, and then it was much smaller for the years that came after, whether it was local or national election year. So I just wanted to find out if your study was able to pick up that nuance and whether it might have influenced the number of responses.
Thank you. Let's move round. We'll go backwards, so please keep your hands in the air. We'll go round like that. So go ahead.
Thank you. Also, Nick Borain, independent political analyst. Also to Dr. Gordon. And I beg you to not misinterpret this question, but has there been any studies of the attitudes of South Africans towards foreigners and xenophobia? Has there been any studies of real grievances against, whether it relates to jobs or drug dealing, or that South Africans have experienced either in isolated ways, and that those views have spread, because let's face it, it is a very common and widespread feeling amongst South Africans, that xenophobia that you've described.
Thank you. Let's move back.
Sorry, can you hear me?
So sorry, we're going round that way. So we'll come round to you in a minute. Thank you.
Thanks very much. My question is directed to University of Pretoria, Doctor. I think there is one aspect where you have indicated the VUCA effect. So when you relate to the VUCA effect, to me it speaks to the understanding of what is happening in the global community and what is happening probably, or what can as well happen in Africa. But what I want to know is, in practice, who will benefit from, if probably on your research you have went to a point where we will understand where are we going with these free trade like agreements, that is one. Where are we going, who will benefit and who will lose, and the impact of the losers. You know, like what will be probably reactions from the losers on the free trade like agreement? Who will win and who will lose?
Thank you. Just behind you then.
My name is Johnny Muteba. I'm from the Pan-African Chamber of Commerce. My question is for Prof. Lepere and also for Don. It's around the CFTA. Our chamber has established the Africa Trade Organization. And before the end of this year, we are establishing the Africa Trade Center here in Johannesburg in partnership with the DTI, and later on in other parts of the continent. The first phase of my question is around the role that young people will play in the implementation of the aspirations or desires of the CFTA. As we know, by 2035, we'll have the biggest workforce in the world. What role do you think young people can play? The second part of it is actually for Don, who was speaking about SME development. How do we then empower South African SMEs?
Oh, so sorry, can you please, we can't hear you on stage, or didn't hear all of that question. Can you repeat, please, or can we get a stronger mic?
Oh.
If you do want to come closer, you can, just so that the panelists can hear you.
Okay, I'll try this other one. So the question actually was, based on the CFTA, what role do you think young people in Africa can play to make sure that whatever it is that we desire in this continental opportunity can actually be sort of realized? The second phase of it is the role that SME development from a regional point of view can play to make sure that we realize the vision of the goals of the CFTA.
Thank you. Let's come down the front here now, and we'll come up the other side.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? My name is Dumi Moyo. I'm from UJ.
Some sound again. We have a, can we correct that mic?
Yes. My name is Dumi Moyo from UJ. My question is directed to Dr. Gordon on the paper on xenophobia. A year ago, when Shirley Mbembe was speaking at a conference on xenophobia, mentioned that, emphasized the point you're making that actually South Africa does not have a monopoly of xenophobia. That actually what's different is how xenophobia is performed in South Africa, different from other places. I just wanted to get your comment on the geography of xenophobia, because I just wanted to understand from the sample that you looked at, people that were talking about sentiments on xenophobia, whether, because there's this assumption that this is something that is happening in the margins. We don't quite have a sense of who actually is xenophobic. Is it just people in the margins that are fighting for jobs and other resources, or is it a nationwide problem which cuts across class, race, and gender?
Thank you. And we have one on this at the back. You've had your hand up, sorry, forever, so you can go, and then we'll come down. Okay, go for it. Try and be as quick as you can, please. We'll fit in as many as we can.
My name is Anthony. I'm from the Department of Sociology, UJ. My question goes to Stephen. Following through, your debate on your conversation around xenophobia, my questions are twofold. Firstly, you identified some traits with regards to, how non-South Africans are characterized: drug dealers, job stealers, diseased. Where do these dominant discourses come from that they are constructed as such? And this spills over to the next comment that I'd like to raise, that there have been key political figures or people of influence in South Africa who've made utterances that have somewhat spawned these xenophobic sentiments. Can we link the two? Thank you.
Thank you. At the front here.
Thank you, if you can hear. Michael Kahn, I have two questions. One or a comment in regard to the scenarios. They're very beautiful. My question is this: where's language in cohesion? There's an absolute silence on language. you've got this constructed word, it's beautiful, is bourgeois. Well, bourgeois is French, it's English, it's American, now it's in IsiXhosa, but without a common language, we march forward blind. We don't understand what we're doing. So it's an observation. The second is basically to Dawn and Garth. Where does the Southern African Customs Union fit into your thinking? What can we learn from it? Has it been a good or a bad thing? Is it good that we subsidize 3-4 other countries in exchange for them never being able to industrialize? What are the lessons for that for the free trade area? Does it mean that the big will prevail over the weak?
Thank you. I think we can fit in 3 more. So there's 2 hands in the middle that have been up forever as well. So we'll go for you 2. And then we'll go across to the side as well. So that I don't want to be sort of, what is it, rightist? Let's make sure you get your chance as well on the right-hand side here. So just with 3 more, because we are running out of time. So go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm Alison Gilward from Research ICT Africa and the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance. My question is for Professor Garth Lepere. I just wanted you to speak a little bit about the sort of impact, the sort of barriers around infrastructures impacting on the free trade agreement, and also the potential of the free trade agreement to address some of the neo-colonial legacies around infrastructures and I most specifically want to focus on digital infrastructure, because our digital infrastructure, of course, we're still dependent. We hub through London and various things in order to reach different parts of the continent. But I want to specifically focus on digital infrastructure because it is a kind of underpinning of the takeoff of the Continental Free Trade Agreement. And considering that across the continent we lack the sort of 20% critical mass internet penetration that you need to see these network effects and positive effects, productivity effects in the economy, etc. And also because of the lack of harmonization on the data side, which is absolutely going to be critical, in the taxation side, etc. So the lack of policy harmonization, particularly around data protection, and the potential positive impact this could have on rectifying those neo-colonial imbalances around our infrastructure planning and practices.
Okay, thank you. The 2 more that we had identified, go ahead.
Good morning. Thabo Lusore. I want to ask the question, thanks to the panel, but my question is to the person who's presenting on the African Free Trade Agreement. Now, the instrument itself, I want to ask a question around the instrument. Who has ratified, who hasn't, and how far in that regard? And then my question, the first presentation by Zinafodi is quite touching to me because, this is quite a serious issue, and I think we should also have a level of sensitivity as to how do we deal with in that space. How do we take the notion of shared history as a way to counteract this kind of behavioral, attitudinal problem we have? I found that in my generation of people in Cape Town, we struggled with this question because a lot of people between 35 and or young people, or just generally in society, we try to counteract these kind of issues, but I think we had problems with dealing with law and migration as in the South African context. So there were the regional groups of youth discussing this issue. We found that those are 2 issues that we still want to be more informed by policy by. Yeah, so 1 question, just kind of also sentiments from my side.
Okay, and then our final question, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Zenzo Moyo. I work for MISTRA. My question is directed to Stephen, and I actually feel for you because it seems as if most questions were coming to you. It would seem to me that the way we define xenophobia is quite slippery, and more so when it comes to government officials and policy makers. To this extent, you would find that what we think to be xenophobia, to them it is not xenophobia. It's mostly defined within the realms of criminality and so on. So I would probably appreciate a comment from you within that framework to say, is there a way of measuring the criminality in xenophobia that influences the way policymakers define that in a way that seems to be different from what others think as what defines xenophobia?
Okay, I'm sorry, we have to cut it there. So I'm sorry for the last speaker, but I said only one more, and I exercise my right as the chair, okay? So if you have any comments, we can do that over tea, but we now have to ask our panelists to respond if we are to stick to our schedule, and I'm informed we have to stick to our schedule, okay? So please, can I ask the panelists to come up? I don't know which order you'd like to go. Dr. Nacho, perhaps first, and then please to stick to 2 minutes in your response if possible, and then, as I said, you can, of course, engage over tea, so it's not over, okay?
Thank you so much for all the questions and your comments. It's valued. Who will benefit, who will lose from the tripartite free trade area and the continental free trade area? You must know that there's 2 big trade agreements running parallel tracks. So there's 26 member states in your tripartite free trade area. And the numbers we got, 54 out of 55 joined the continental free trade area, but only 22 signed in order for that agreement to kick in, which it did in July 2019. Who exactly the 22 countries are, that I can give you the list later on, but it's 22. Nigeria hasn't ratified, and President Buhari was quite careful and very concerned. He doesn't want finished goods and finished products in his market. So that is where they are at with the agreement. Yeah. Who will benefit? Obviously, I think, not obviously, sorry, but I think your peripheral economies, your smaller economies, they will be the big losers. But in a regional integration, a region building scheme, we are looking at winners for all, and the winners will vary depending on the type of trade that is being conducted. And that is why it's so important not to be so dogmatic on tariff lines, but to rather look at how one can use 2 or 3 commodities in agro-industrialization, in value addition, that has a competitive, look at our competitive and comparative advantage with the region. And that is why we signed these trade agreements. Initially, when we were invited in by SADC in 1994, things were very different. When you open up your market, you let businesses run loose, and it just created a lot of problems in terms of divergence, economic growth divergence. So there will, in this new, like I said, President Buhari from Nigeria, he's very concerned, and they are not willing to open up their market yet. And so I think how to have this trade-off, as we've mentioned, yes, it's critical to look at how you're going to negotiate and make it attractive for member states to buy into the agreement. The most important thread that runs through it is the rules of origin. Who makes what? And where is, for example, fabric made? Previously, those were major problems. And so even South Africa suffered with textile industries closing, specifically in the Western Cape. So the role that young people can play in this era, which is the biggest, it's the biggest free trade area globally. What role can young people play? And that is up to policy implementation. If we look at education and all the presentations that we've heard, we can plug into a number of areas. Education is key. I gave one example in the presentation of leather, where we have a problem where we cannot manufacture our leather to a global standard, and only 4 conglomerates are attached to the leather industry, which has been created in the 19th century. And they're all white, and that is how we can look at the 50% of our unemployment rate is primarily youth, to look at how to educate and make it attractive for them in industrial engineers. There is a list is endless. Sorry. Where is SACO in the thinking and in my thinking, and what is the lessons that we can learn from the customs union? Well, SACO is quite old. It's 1910, I think 1899 it was created. South Africa has moved extensively, I would say that, from where we are. That agreement was negotiated thrice now, and they're looking at a component of development, so that all the money goes to their fiscus. And we are really building relations, even with our previous president, he had quite a few visits throughout the region with all SACO member states, and it's still, Lesotho, for example, is critical for Gauteng. It provides our water. And therefore, we saw, even with Thabo Mbeki, with President Cyril Ramaphosa when he was deputy, the importance of working with that government when they had issues with the elections, and a number of parliamentarians were killed. So there's a lot of relationship building. We import sugar, example, from Swaziland because they don't have a market. And so what we can do, though, is, for me, what I think we can do is not export raw materials, raw steel, cheap fallow alloys, and 1 and 2 level and 3 level steel and iron ore products, but build relationships with SACO and see how we can come up with a product in industrialization, instead of just exporting and looking at trade figures. So that is, I think, my thinking from SACO. What is going to happen with the negotiations is very intricate, because the East African community, belonging to the COMESA EAC, SADC tripartite free trade area, they have a customs union. We belong to a customs union. You can only belong to one customs union when you conduct trade. You cannot belong to several others. So how that's going to happen eventually with the continental free trade area, and when they have a customs union. So there is quite a bit of discussion on that topic. In infrastructure and its potential, that is your question. Yeah.
2 minutes to answer big questions. Look, I think, the Continental Free Trade Agreement anticipates, I would say, different ecosystems of activity. There is a primary responsibility, I would say, on the African member states to put in place policies, to put in place the necessary systems, I would say, around critical dimensions, critical strategic dimensions of the CFTA as these relate to production, as these relate to development finance, as these relate to trade, trade and industrial policy, as well as security and governance. Now, that is a tall order, given the nature and character of the post-colonial state in Africa. But nevertheless, I do think that the CFTA will have a disciplining effect in improving the national policy, regulatory, and governance environments of the member states. They will be forced, in many ways, to adapt, to put in place the kind of stabilization measures at national level that would, at least from a very low base, give life to the essential elements of the CFTA, starting with a threshold of tariff liberalization that will allow for the free movement of goods, services, and people. That's at the one level. At the other level, which is much more complicated, problematic, is what happens to the capacity, institutional, and managerial deficits at the 8 regional economic communities. Now, the 8 RECs are supposed to be the building blocks of continental unity. And many of them really are dysfunctional and weak. So, there is a serious structural political problem with the regional economic communities that also has to be addressed. But I think, a virtuous circle could be created, provided the members within regional economic communities get the basics right in terms of getting the CFTA into first gear, as it were. There is, I think, a very important initiative coming to the digital question around the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, PIDA. It has, as an essential component, building harmonized or developing harmonized digital platforms. This is very much in an embryonic stage, and it will take quite quite a bit of technical work to ensure that you meet the kind of deficits that you identified. Who has ratified the agreement? There are 22 countries that are non-LDCs. These are countries that are not classified as least developing countries. As I understand it, the 35 LDCs have been given sort of a bridging period of 10 to 15 years to meet the thresholds for full participation in the CFTA.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Prophet Pierre. Okay, Kayela, it's your turn, you're up. And we'll finish with
Thank you, Chair. I didn't get many questions. Well, I didn't get any. I don't know if it's because my presentation was boring or it was very clear. However, I'll just address the comment on language. On using terminology such as the Sibujwa and Gwara and Naila Walk, it's naming of the scenarios to try and make them more accessible and popular, because these are dance moves. These are popular dance moves amongst the youth today. I should have maybe given a bit of background. But in terms of language, we did consider, it did come up, the issue of language. Because if you recall, one of the main key driver in terms of where we are is inequality, and language appeared as another site of inequality, where you have particular languages dominating, spaces such as this one. And what we found also is that one way to take us to Naile Walk scenario would be to focus on mother tongue instruction. Now, I know this space is very contested because the issue of mother tongue instruction has been coming to particular quarters, for example, especially within the Afri-forums, where they've been pushing for mother tongue instruction in terms of Afrikaans. But what we found is that this is relevant across the board, in particular when you deal with mother tongue instruction around the STEM subjects. We found that, especially in primary school or in basic education space, young people can comprehend some of the complex terminology or ideas if they were to actually attain that knowledge through mother tongue instruction. Because sometimes the terms are so abstract, like for example, there was an issue about symmetry in mathematics. And you'd find that other people would think you're talking about the burial ground, not symmetry. So we found that language, it would be very important, and if we were to pay attention to that, we could find ourselves in Naila Walk. I did not quite get the comment from our colleague over there. I heard something about shared history, and I'm not sure if it was directed to Dr. Gordon or to myself. Okay, I think the reason why we have, the reason why we don't have a common understanding of our history is that, first of all, in any setup, you do know that the victor will always be the ones who write history. So that's the one component of it. So where you found that there's been revisions of the curriculum that's now in the basic education space, because first of all, the history that I learned is the same history that my children have been learning. So there hasn't been much change in that regard. We transformed as a society, but not much was done in terms of the history curriculum. Where there's been changes, you'd find that the victor tends to rewrite the history. So you would find components of the liberation history, but it is biased towards a particular liberation movement, while silent on other contributors towards our liberation. So I think those are the spaces that are contested. The fact that, first of all, the history has not changed. We're still learning the Bantu education or like the curriculum that we all learned during apartheid is still there. But there is a process of revision of the curriculum. I know that the Department of Basic Education is really looking, they have a process called decolonizing the history curriculum. So that is one of the aspects that we found as a key driver towards Naila Walk, wherein we take another look at our history curriculum. And this could be done through a partnership between the Department of Arts and Culture and a Department of Basic Education by paying attention to alternative ways of knowing, alternative ways of understanding our history, but also inclusion of indigenous knowledge systems within the curriculum. And that way, that is one of the strategies that could be adopted to drive our society towards a more cohesive one.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we end up with Dr. Gordon then, who has the last say, had the most questions and fewer minutes to speak. So,
Given that I am confronted by this problem, I will address it by taking a very broad view of the feedback, starting with the last question, which was, in a very general sense, about how we define xenophobia, an issue that has bedeviled many academics and has created a level of contestation within our public discourse. And it really helps us to consider the history of the word. Xenophobia was first used, as far as we can tell, in 1901 in a French novel talking about prejudice against Jews of German descent, who were a significant minority in France at the time and were involved in a scandal which we can go into, but I will not distract the audience with that right now. The word was then taken by scholars, journalists, what have you, and used to describe prejudice both towards people of Jewish origin and people who were foreign-born. In the mid-20th century, they decided that anti-Semitism was a better term for prejudice against Jews, and ever since then, xenophobia has very specifically focused on prejudice towards the foreign-born. Now, we can look at two actions or the attitudes of an individual, and we can say that this is prejudice, or we can say this is not prejudice. Right? Donald Trump, for example, famously describes himself as the least racist person ever. Other people, myself, would not agree with this statement. Right? You can look at two different actions, two different ways, and come to very different conclusions. All right. So to take your point about when we look at a specific behavior, say a crime, how do we determine the motivation of that crime? Was that crime a hate crime? Right? In this case, motivated by xenophobia, right? Of course, there are other types of hate crime motivated by homophobia, motivated by racism, right? How do we determine this? Of course, we can borrow from other countries' legislative and policy frameworks, which we are currently doing. There is a long ongoing discourse on hate crime categorization and prosecution in South Africa. So it is certainly possible to achieve this issue, and largely responsibility rests with various law enforcement agencies. Moving on to the question of real grievances. Now, there are common myths, I shall use the word myths, about the effects of international migration on South African society regarding crime, disease, and unemployment. These attitudes are not supported by empirical evidence, right? Nor do we expect them to. The international literature on this issue, which have dealt with very similar questions. Do immigrants cause an increase in crime, disease, and unemployment in the European Union, in Canada, in the United States? These are questions that have been gone into before, and the general consensus from an academic perspective is there's very little evidence to suggest that they play a major role in the generation of any of these problems, right? Obviously, research is ongoing, but at this stage, it would be difficult to show a direct correlation between international migration and the major problems that are often attributed to it. This, of course, does not mean that individual migrants do not commit crime or compete for jobs in very individual cases, but again, from a macro level and from an empiricist level, we do not suggest that they are a major cause of these problems. And I think that has to be stated. I think our former Minister of Home Affairs once said something which I thought was very, very illustrative of this issue. He said, "We do not talk about white crime or black crime, Xhosa crime or Zulu crime, nor should we talk about foreign crime and local or native-born crime. We must deal with crime as it is, right? And not try and stigmatize a community as criminals. So, given that we have defined xenophobia as prejudice towards the foreign-born, we can then move to the question about, is this something that's on the margins, or is this cuts across different social economic groups in South Africa? Now, what I do is I look at attitudes towards international migrants, right? You can define prejudice in lots of different ways and come up with different metrics for prejudice, right? If we look at anti-immigrant sentiments, negative beliefs about international migrants, we find that these do cut across socioeconomic classes, they cut across gender, they cut across population group. Right? It seems that these views are quite widespread. This has been found in my own research as well as by other scholars looking at the issue. I particularly think about the work of the Southern African Migration Project here. Where do these discourses come from? The kind of stereotypes we confront in South Africa regarding international migration do not differ substantially from the kind of stereotypes you see in the UK, in Canada, in the US, in Germany, Spain, France, Italy. You know, it seems a very unfortunate trend in our modern world that immigrants are blamed for a host of social and economic problems in which the data suggests they do not contribute to. Right. So I would be reticent on blaming current levels of anti-immigrant sentiment in our country on politicians. I think that would be a bit of a step too far. Certainly politicians do use an anti-immigrant discourse on many occasions, and I think we've seen that in South Africa, both in our most recent period, and of course, in the 1990s, if people remember our first Home Affairs Minister, Buthelezi, and his rhetoric on international migration. Policymakers, and particularly look at party manifestos for the 2019 national elections, were actually quite inclusive on the issue of international migration and did not show the kind of restrictive, nativist approach that, say, is popular amongst the Republican Party in the USA or amongst the Conservative Party in the UK. That being said, this is not to say that individual politicians do not participate in this kind of rhetoric, and indeed there has been research, to talk to my colleague, which shows that in Africa we can find a correlation between electoral cycle and a spike in negative attitudes towards migration. My research, of course, because it is based on cross-sectional data, has been unable to show this, and I must therefore defer to the work of other scholars on this issue. And I feel that unfortunately I might be running a little over time. I apologize. Thank you very much for your questions. I look to engage with you more on this issue during the break. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gordon. I know that we all want to spend the next hour talking about this, but we just can't, okay? So we have to go and have tea. That's just what we have to do right now. So please, we are 20 minutes behind. So can I ask that you gulp the tea down quite quickly so we can resume the program in the next 15 minutes or so. So please be back in at least 15 minutes. You can drink tea in that time. It's possible. Thank you very much to the panelists once again, and we'll resume again in about 15 minutes.
Colleagues, please note that the next session is the parallel breakaway sessions, and please also note that we're going to KO4 and not KO9 as it states in the program for the first, what? Is it citizenship? Yeah, the citizenship and identity breakaway. It's KO4.
Fortunately or unfortunately, this issue attracts a lot of heat and emotion on times. I thought the questions were very respectful. Sometimes I get quite accusatory questions around this issue.
Thank you so much.